I'm delighted to be able to introduce John. Before we start talking about what John's going to cover, I'm a bit disappointed how many people here just on the dark side of the rules. What's going on with the new rules. So anyway, delighted you're all here. I've known John a long time, so he used to race a Wayfarer a long time ago, before me, and a Finn. But then John and I have crossed paths over the years, usually collaboratively, with the Extreme 40s, Olympic Games and various other big championships. I'm delighted that I've always had John as a sensible partner who's covering my backside as a race officer. John has also had quite a distinguished career outside just racing himself. He was the World Sailing Chairman of Race Officials between 2004 and 2008. He's been international jury for 6 Olympic Games, which is quite impressive, including chairman at the Tokyo Olympics, which took place in 21, but obviously 2020 when it should have taken place because of the COVID years. He's also chairman of the Racing Rules Committee between 2014 and 2020, and he was responsible with his team for the previous rule book and all the changes that took place.
Messed it up now.
He now got to criticise all the new rules. And then finally, John was awarded in 2021 the Pepe Croce Trophy for the contribution to sailing, which is an award every year for people with significant input into our sport of sailing over the years, and John was awarded that in 2021. Tonight he is with his partner, Cristiana Amaral, who was jury secretary at the Paris Olympics. It's just taking place. So she's got to hang a bit as well.
So you can ask her all the questions. Any questions? Ask Christian.
So I'm delighted we have John here tonight. Hope you enjoyed the talk. John, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. Lovely to meet you all. Racing rules. Does anybody suffer from insomnia? Here's the cure. So I hope to try and make it a little bit more interesting. But I know people are interested in the changes to the rules, which is helpful for people who knew the rules in the first place, but doesn't help other people. And I've been informed that the principal rule for the Royal Thames is the larger the better. But that's fine. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how the changes in the rule book come about, just a few minutes, and then get into some of the changes. I'm planning to fly through them in about 20 minutes. I would suggest you don't necessarily try to remember all this stuff, because there's quite a lot, and I send the presentation to Tim, and it will be available to anybody who asks for it, so you can actually look at it in your own time. And if you do have any questions, there's my emails on there as well. I do my best. I don't promise to respond to everybody instantly. But my starting point is the rules are actually part of the game. And if we don't play to the rules, it actually spoils the game for a lot of people. So I come from, let's try and understand them a bit, so that we enjoy our sport a lot more and avoid disputes. We don't end up in the protest room and we end up in the bar. Is that a reasonable place to be? So you'll never find me telling people you have to go to the room with this because it's a problem. I just don't think that works for our sport. There are times when you do need to, but that's not where I particularly come from. So then I'm going to show you some techniques that I've used and developed I still race XODs out of Lymington. And I find it much more interesting than sitting on protest committees, really. And the XODs out of Lymington are a law unto themselves. So I have a technique for applying the rules at the speed at which you race, which even applies when you're foiling. Is anybody foiling? No, it's not quite. Oh, we've got one. So, I mean, for me, that's the more interesting end. How do we actually apply the rules and make them work to help us enjoy our sport? So we'll see how well I do. You can judge that at the end. So I'd like to reserve quite a bit of time for doing that sort of process and thinking, and we'll see how we go.
2041.
Well, I choose not to go quite full screen because I've actually got the rule book, you see, hiding behind the screen if I need to. Because there is a secret. If in doubt, read the rules. And I hear too many conversations at the bars which are people's opinion of the rules and anecdotes about the rules. And I'm sure. Have you got a rule book behind the bar? Put a rule book behind the bar. We have a discussion in the bar about rules. Anyway, let's move on. So, this is very quickly. I'm going to fly through this. So every 4 years, all the rules, the case books, the call books, it all gets updated, as well as all the manuals for race officials. It is a massive amount of work. It's about 10,000 man-hours goes into updating all of the stuff that is published officially. It is massive. We're not going to do that tonight. So what happens if somebody finds a problem, and I'm sure we've already found some problems with this one, they go through World Sailing, through submissions, and any national authority can submit to change a rule, any class association can submit to change a rule, or committee chairman of World Sailing can do that. It all ends up on the work pile for Racing Rules Committee that I chaired, as Tim said, a few years ago. And I think I processed over 500 submissions in 4 years. And the problem with all the submissions is you have to look at them and work out not just the rule, but what's the consequences, because all the rules are linked. It's pretty tricky stuff. Anyway, we did it. The first version of this was actually published August the 1st, 2024, and that's required by the regulations of World Sailing. Because it has to be distributed around the world. Every country that doesn't speak English has to translate into their own language before they can publish. And so it's a huge process. 140 languages the book's now published in. So what happens, they all start reading it and they go, oh hang on, I can't translate that. You know, the Chinese don't have a word for the. Doesn't exist. The Italians don't have a word for rule. I mean, so it's been reviewed a lot between August, and then it goes back in November with things that people identified as real problems. This is not going to work. And so in November, Racing Rules Committee get back together and go, oh crikey, we've got to make some changes. And that's why there's some amendments to the rules. And I would defy anybody to update this thing and get it right first time.
Donald Trump would.
There's some places I'll go, as you've just guessed, but I'm honestly not going to go. So unfortunately, the consequence is the book I've got in my hand is out of date. I've actually been through and noted all the pages. There is a document produced which is mostly it's technical, and there is a link, and when you get the presentation you'll find a link to the updated World Sailing Rule Book, which has got all the changes in it. And I actually suggest, especially if you're using online documents and rather than physical rule books, that's the one that you stick with. And that's the one that's hiding behind my presentation. So if we need to refer to the rule book, because in doubt, read the book. There are over 200, come in, please, yeah. Thank you for coming. There are over 200 changes of text from the last rule book. So do you want me to go through them all, word by word? Yeah. Tim, can I just put a bill in? That'll be alright, it'll be fine. So what I've done, I have been through every word. And I've sort of, in my mind, classified them as, well, yeah, but there's no change. It's just reorganised, it's just reworded. There's no effect on anybody. So there's no change. We're not going to mention those tonight. They're in the presentation that you will get. So if you want to go through, so I thought that change, you'll find it listed, but we've not got time to do it tonight. Then at minor, there's a change, but it's really limited consequences. But you never know, it might just catch you out. Because it's not an important change unless you get disqualified as a result of that rule change. Then it becomes, all of a sudden, it becomes important. Significant for me means it happens more often. You're likely to have to come across it on the racecourse. So we need to just understand it. And then there is one major, and some people will argue even that's not a major game change, but I think it's one that's really worth warning you about. So we're going to do that. We're going to gloss over quite a lot. We're going to focus on significant is the area we're going to be focusing, and I'm trying to get through that by 7:15 so that we can move on to more interesting topics than just here's what the new rule says. And the certainty is I don't know all the answers yet. I didn't even know when I was the chairman of the committee the rule book, because when you write your own stuff, you ever done that and then had somebody else review it and they say, did you mean that? And you go, no, I didn't mean that. I meant something else. It's part of the process. So no apologies for it, but we will deal with it. And that might even mean there's some more changes to come. And I'm sure something's going to, what I call, crawl out of the woodwork as we get experience with it. It's the way it is. If you come across something like that, and you really can't understand it, as I said, you'll have my email address. You can always send me, go, I don't understand this, because it's how the rule book gets better. And despite what a lot of people say, it's actually pretty good. You think about the range of vessels, we have to call them now, because it's everything from kiteboarding to multi-yachts to Vendée Globe to America's Cup to Olympic Games to dinghy racing out of Lymington. It covers the whole lot. And unlike soccer, we don't have the same playing field. So writing a rule book that has that scope is pretty challenging. Anyway, so in the end, whatever I say tonight, firstly, I will guarantee you will not remember it all. Read the book. Rather than have, particularly if you have discussions with people and you don't agree about the rules, read the book. I'll stop preaching. So the major change, I think it could be a major change. It's not going to happen very often, but they've changed the definition of finish. So the sailing instructions may now tell you to cross the finishing line, not from the course side. The argument is that's come in for when you're sailing on the river and you've come around a big bend. So you've turned around. So what's the course side? Is it? Oh, there's a headland in the way, or all sorts of things. Creates a lot of discussion. Fastnet ending in Cherbourg. Anybody done that?
Yeah.
Which way do you cross the finishing line? Well, it depends on how they lay up and set up the whole thing. So it is possible, and what I'm not sure of, I'm not clear how that gets enacted through the rule. What the sailing instructions would say. Would they actually say this changes the direction you would normally cross the line, or do they just say this mark has a port or starboard required side and you have to follow that, and it follows that you will now, you know the whole thing with hook finishes?
Yeah.
It's much easier, as far as I can see, to set up a hook finish. And I think that's a game change. But we'll see. So significant changes. This probably affects race officials more, and Tim tells me it wouldn't affect him at all because he would never do it anyway. But November abandonment is only applied to racing in progress. So if you're out on the water and multiple fleet starts, and the race committee are going, oh, it's horrible, we want to send everybody home, but some boats are racing and some boats aren't racing, you've got to put November up and send the fleets that are racing home, and you've got to put AP up with Alpha to send the boats that haven't started home. So you will end up on the committee boat, on the water. I mean, on the shore it's probably not such a problem because nobody's racing when you put the signal on the shore, presumably. Well, multi-class events it could be. And that's one of the reasons for the change. Because you can imagine, we run the Olympic Games, there's classes out on the course, there's classes still on the shore waiting to go. You put November up on the shore, have you just abandoned all the people who are racing? You don't do that anymore. It's AP on the shore or before anybody's racing. So if you've got a fleets out there, multiple fleets, some racing, some not, it is November over AP or vice versa, over whatever you want to do. But it means if your mark boats have got all the signals, they might need more flags. I think in the end it's a good change because it's clearer, but it means race committees have got to really know what they're doing. If you're racing, November applies to you. If you're not yet racing, AP applies to you. That's the golden rule for boats racing. Now there's a lot of definitions that have changed, and this is one, and you'll see in a moment that one of them has changed since this was done. There's a new definition. We've never had a definition of continuous obstruction. And people have argued, well, how big does it have to be continuous? Now, 3 boat lengths. How do you do 3 boat lengths? Well, it's probably easier than 5 boat lengths, but I'm sure there'll be some discussion about whether it really was long enough.
Which boat?
It is of the shortest hull referred to in the rule. They thought about that one, at least. But as always, and this is no change, a boat that is racing is not a continuous obstruction ever. And a committee vessel, which is also a mark, which can be colossal. I mean, sometimes you have a colossal committee boat. Even if it's more than 3 hull lengths, it's never a continuous obstruction, which means you can't claim room at a committee boat that's a starting mark. I'm sort of keeping going because if I stop it all the time, but please do feel free just to go, hang on, stop.
Yeah, sorry, John.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify that point with the obstruction.
Yes.
So I'm also an ex-OB sailor, and as you know, we go very slowly.
We do.
So, you know, obstructions are quite important to us.
Yes.
They can stop us dead.
So an XOD, I think, is 8 metres long.
Yeah.
So unless it's 24 metres long, it's not a continuous obstruction. I think so. A string of moorings, if you can't sail between them, is a continuous obstruction because it would be more than 3 boat lengths long.
So does this affect the whole obstruction? So you can't call obstruction?
No.
It's continuous.
Continuous obstruction is actually only is effective in quite limited circumstances. Right. It's about whether you can put your nose in along the shoreline or along and force the boat that you've. So Cowsweek, who sails Cowsweek? So Cowsweek, when you're coming against the current, up, downwind, can you, and the boats behind are catching all the boats in front, can you put your nose in and force the boat in front off the shore? Yeah. That's the time the continuous obstruction is most interesting. Right. And it's, honestly, it's about a half-hour chat on continuous obstructions.
Right. So it's different, a continuous obstruction is different to an obstruction?
Correct.
Right, okay.
It has to be. So a shoreline is a continuous obstruction. There's always debates about a pier head.
Yeah.
So if you sail at Royal Solent, where the big pier comes out, as you cross it going down the Solent, the obstruction is only this wide, for want of a better description.
Yeah.
It's not a continuous obstruction. If you happen to get right inshore and you're sailing out along that pier, it becomes a continuous obstruction because you're passing it for more than 3 of your hull lengths. Which is why it's a bigger talk than we're going to have time for tonight.
Yeah, no, I can see that you've got a lot of discussion on that
If you
one.
did that there, you'd be inside the moorings and disqualified.
Sorry?
If you did that there, you'd have gone inside the moorings probably. and-
Well, there are other places. I mean, Southend, you've got a big pier. There's no moorings. It happens in quite a lot of places. I mean, we get it at Lymington all the time off Hurst Point. If you're going out through the Narrows, it happens quite a lot. Yeah.
So I just thinking about going back a bit to the major change on you can finish going either way through.
Oh yes, yes,
Does
yes.
that not affect the right of way if you're both coming out to like the pin end and the finish line?
Well,
One can go one way around and the other can go.
well, that's the risk. That's why I think it's a major change, because I think you've got to be really clear about which way do you cross that finishing line. And as I said, I'm not sure how that's going to be transmitted through the sailing instructions that they've invoked that clause in the rule.
They're not suggesting that you can cross the finish line from either direction.
Correct.
That's not
There
what it's
will be a correct way to cross the finishing line, but it may be from the side which is from the way which is surprising to some people.
Read the book.
Yeah. Right. This is one I'm going to put this. I'm going to use the boats on there. I haven't had time to draw all the diagram. So Rule 18 has been restructured without very many changes. There's only one change which we're just going to cover, and that actually is buried in the definition of mark room rather than in the rule itself. So you now still have to sail to the mark. We can talk about that another time. You're allowed to round the mark, and then, this is new, leave it astern. So when you've left it astern, the rule turns off. Which begs a bit of the question, if I've got foul current and my stern's clear, but if I tack now, I'm going to hit the mark. Well then, the argument is, you haven't yet had room to pass it on the required side. So the second element has not been satisfied. But it's going to cause discussion. How far past can you go? I always judge it that if you end up tacking and you end up passing quite close to it because the tide's pushing you into it, you're fine. You have to look at it back, how close did you ever get to the mark? If you never got within 2 boat lengths of the mark, you took more room than you're entitled to. The biggest change is where this yellow is. So the rule used to say at a windward mark, I'll try and get this at the top of so the wind's always coming from the top. Can you actually see this? So I'll use blue and yellow because they normally show up better. So you're coming in, there's no doubt, you're coming in on port, you're going to tack around the mark. The rule used to clearly say that this boat was entitled to the room to tack, not just, it's gone. This rule is that the windward boat is entitled to mark room until she's head to wind. And then Rule 18, which gives her mark room, turns off because they're now on opposite tacks. And I was really worried about it, but I've been satisfied that what they're saying is that by the time this happens, this boat will have the room to round the mark without there being a problem. And if the outside boat squeezes it, she's at risk of breaking Rule 14 and causing contact. We'll see. I can see it's only a problem in some. I think it might be a bigger problem still with the current coming down against you. Probably. We'll see. XODs. We're going to. We'll find out.
We'll test that one.
There was a fundamental problem with this. That fundamental problem was that part of the rule was in Rule 18, but as soon as you get on opposite tacks, Rule 18 is turned off. So you've got a rule that's contradicting itself, for want of a better description. So they fixed that, but we'll see how that goes. So, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So until you go head to wind, you're fine, you're entitled to room. You're also entitled to the room, there's an argument, you're entitled to the room to round the mark. But the trouble is that you turn the rule off by the time you get past head to wind.
Just one question. You said two things slightly different there.
Okay.
So you said that rule turns off once you are at head to win.
Past head to win.
It's past.
Past.
Okay,
It
just to
is.
be clear.
Thank you. It is past head to win. It's when you're past head to win that it's clear that you're now on the opposite tack.
Okay. That makes more sense.
And they're saying they don't think it's going to be a problem. And I'm sort of not as worried about it as I was about a week ago. So I've talked to them, and I'm not here to criticise the rules, by the way, to understand the rules. I mean, there's no point in criticising them. They're what they are. This is a good change in my view. Rule 14, if there's contact, you used to be subject to Rule 14. It was very unclear if you do something that causes the next boat to cause contact with somebody else, were you culpable or not? The answer now is yes. So if you force somebody to hit a mark or obstruction and they get damaged, even if you don't hit them, you're still done. I think that's a good change.
John?
Yes?
Is the question on whether damaging a mark is damage as a result?
Yes, it is, because it says causing damage, and that's now actually cleared up with this, because you've caused damage, not to another boat, you've caused damage. So I think that's actually much clearer now. I've put part 5 in here because it's been totally reorganised. I know somebody who was partly responsible for that, and he's standing in front of you. We could tell you why, but it takes a long time. So I've put it as significant, because if ever you're involved in protests or redress or whatever, the rule is completely reorganised. For the better, and much more logical. But just to warn you, it would be good to get your handle on it and go through it a few times so you get where's everything moved to. And if you're writing sailing instructions or notices of race, a lot of the rule references have changed as a result of this reorganisation. And enough said. Minor changes. I better keep going so I get onto some other stuff today. So we're getting into the smaller stuff. But you never know. There's a change in terminology. So terminology says a boat, as it's used in the rules, is a sailboat with a crew on board. It now says if you're subject to the racing rules. Otherwise, somebody going out in a cruiser who's a sailing boat with the crew on board, they're subject to... No, they're not. So the rules reserve the word boat for... I can't use the word vessel. Things that float on the water that are racing. Vessel, race committee, ferries, people not racing, every other thing that floats is a vessel, is how the rules distinguish between the two. And they have to do that because clearly there's some rules that apply to boats that don't apply to vessels. And that's how we distinguish.
Same for wing foilers or IQ foil? Or
The crew, there are boats with a crew on board, subject to the racing rules. So foiling.
Just foiling and not
If you, well, we can start that whether even boats. There you go. But some people call I sail them. I can be rude. Some people call XOD boats, and some people are not sure they're not logs.
But there is also a relevance there, because that can apply to two completely, think of Cowsweek, that can apply to two completely different race fleets. Yeah. So two fleets are both subject to the rules, so both are included inside that definition.
That's no change.
Absolutely.
So the rules, as soon as you've got two boats racing under different event authorities, the rules apply to them, and there's even a rule in Part 5 that tells you how you deal with that dispute. Definitions. That's a small change. So the definition of finished has changed. It doesn't. So now you can finish as long as it's after your starting signal. It used to be you have to start. Well, if you were OCS, you never started, so you could never finish. So you can keep going around, and the important thing about having boats finishing is there's a point at which you can't correct the errors after you've finished. So it's a bit technical, but you might come across it. Now this is the one, it's got November 2024 in here. This was updated in after this book. So an obstruction is still an object that you cannot pass without changing course substantially if you're sailing directly towards it and 1/1 whole length from it. That's no change. It's an object that can safely be passed on one side only. A shoreline or a post marking an outfall or something like that. This is the new bit, an object, area or line that is so designated in any rule. It used to be in the sailing instructions only. This is actually helpful. It tells you a boat is never an obstruction if you're racing against them unless you have to keep clear of them. The reason this is helpful, who races in the Solent? And you've got the harbour bylaws about the moving zone in front of large vessels. Now, in order to write that into the rules, so the question is, could you call it an obstruction and call room to tack on it if you're approaching that line? Unless you write the sailing instructions really carefully, historically, that was actually quite tricky. Now, as long as you invoke the harbour bylaws in your notice of race, it becomes an area that is governed by rules. So it becomes an obstruction and you can call for room on it, which is actually a better change. I need to keep going. It's a bit technical this, but there's two principles in the book. One's about the environment and one's about sportsmanship. It's now clear they are not rules themselves, they are principles, not rules. So you can't actually protest somebody for not looking after the environment. You might report them for misconduct. If somebody was throwing trash and it's bringing the sport into disrepute, you could report them and the sport could deal with it, but you can't protest them. Bit technical, but it's a change. Change of definition. So a lot of rules had, you have to start, you have to sail the course, and then you have to finish. Now the start and finish are put into one definition with sail the course. So starting and finishing is now, so the middle bit is going around all the marks in the right order and the right side and all that sort of stuff and through gates and so, but now the start and the finish. So now you actually do have to start, sail the course and finish. Otherwise you haven't sailed the course.
Can I ask you a question about the exclusion zone?
Yes.
It's really about enforcement, but in Cowsweek there's a 500 metre exclusion, or 1,000 metre, I can't remember, exclusion zone in front of moving major, large
whatever
ships.
it is, yeah. Yep.
And they're going at a number of knots, 12, 15, 20 knots,
Yep.
whatever. So that exclusion zone is moving very fast through the fleet all the time, 1,000 metres out. And you get to the point where you deem you're within 1,000 metres of the bow of the boat, you call obstruction and you force the boat to tack. Possibly because you want to get out of the time more than 1,000 metres or whatever it is. How is the race committee going to realistically enforce that?
How would the protest, well, the race committee don't have to enforce it. It's other boats racing that have to enforce the laws.
How the protest committee?
Well, they can protest, and when I do a whole presentation on what I call the nature of rules. No matter how tightly you write the rules, there is always a point where if I do this, I'm not breaking the rule. And I now do this, I'm now breaking the rule. So every rule in the book, you have that decision to make. A port tack boat passes clear and stern of a starboard tack boat. How close can you be? You have that dilemma, if you like, in every single rule, in every single sport. Look at offside in soccer. Look at the ball crossing the goal line. It's true in every sport, and the process of resolving it is always the same. You take the evidence. If it's a protest committee, they decide on the balance of probability. Do they think that was reasonable or not reasonable? And that's the world we have to live with. It ain't black and white. Yes, I could do a long. There's another. Tim, I'll have to come back and do another.
that was a good answer. I think that's
Anyway, this makes a lot of rules a lot easier to write, because you just, instead of writing start, sails the course and finishes, you just write now sails the course. So it's simplified some rules construction. Proper course, those that are used to team racing or match racing, but this one's gone backwards and forwards over the years. So this is the slam dunk. The question is, when you slam dunk somebody, so yellow comes in on starboard, crosses blue on port, and so yellow's still tacking, has not got to close hauled, and blues are still, but gets the overlap in that period of time between yellow passing head to wind and getting to close hauled. And the question is, does rule 17 at that moment stop blue from sailing above close haul, or is she allowed to? And it's been different in team racing, in match racing, in fleet racing. In fleet racing, it has now got to, the rule does not apply, and the rule applies the restriction. So in fact, it makes a slam dunk easier to make work. Because when the boat comes in, and if she's not overlapped, while the boat's tacking, from the moment she gets the overlap, she's come from astern and she's not allowed to luff above close haul. So it makes the slam dunk easier to make work.
Sorry.
Marks and instructions.
Sorry.
Yep.
The boat hasn't completed the tack.
Sorry?
The boat hasn't completed the tack.
If you haven't completed a tack, you're subject to rule 13.
Yeah.
If the overlap is established while you are completing your tack, you now cannot, but you've got the overlap. So rule 17, which stops you from luffing, and I always get it's a double negative rule. Makes it. So I think it makes the slam dunk easier to make stick, because the lever boat can't luff. Because rule 17 turns on.
So you have to establish the overlap before they go through head to
You
wind.
used to have to establish the overlap any time after going past head to wind, but before getting close to hauled. That allowed you to luff, to squeeze the windward boat.
Now
You can't do that.
establish
You can't do that now.
Now you have to establish overlap before they go through head to wind.
Correct. Well, yes, there's no overlap before you go through head to wind, because they're on opposite tacks. So it makes it much easier to put a slam dunk on.
Does that rule stay in play for team racing? Or is that one of
I
the
have not. I am going to confess, I have not even got as far as reading the team racing rules.
Thanks, Bruno.
Mr. Hebbert?
Yes, it does.
It applies to team racing.
But not my team racing.
So rule 18, as I said, there's no change here, but it has been, I put it on here as minor, there's no change, but the whole sequence of the rule has changed. It's actually much more logical than it was, and I'm not going to go into all the detail here. Trust me, it hasn't changed, but it's worth, I put it on here because it's worth reading through, so you just get used to rules that you used to call one thing. The numbering's changed a bit. Because I'm under a bit of time pressure to keep going. Rule 20 has changed. It is now absolutely clear. The only words you can use if you want room to tack are room to tack. You can't say water for a windward mark. Room to tack. They're the only words that work. And there's the usual caveat in international events. You can use local language if that is the language that's understood by everybody racing, but English is always acceptable. Okay, we're getting through. Boats, if you sail, particularly dinghies, it affects more. PFDs, the class rules can now tell you that you have to wear your PFD at all times while racing or all times afloat. It used to have to be in the notice of race or sailing instructions. It can now be in the class rules. So if you sail smaller boats particularly, check your class rules. It's in some class rules, but it shouldn't have been. If you have scoring penalties, that's now got to be stated in the notice of race. Doesn't happen very often, we can pass on that, but it would affect you. Does anybody sail soulings? We stopped sailing soulings sometimes. Starboats, we've stopped sailing those, have we? When some crew would wear a harness. So the rule here has changed so that it doesn't refer to a trapeze harness, it refers to a crew harness. So if you start putting a device to help your crew sit outboard, the rule applies to them just as it would, which means the harness gets weighed, basically, and the class rules might have to permit it. It's now measured in fresh water, because we had a deal at the Olympics where the difference between salt water and fresh water made a difference between somebody being disqualified from 2 Olympic races. It looks trivial, but it became pretty serious. And the rules now allow, tracking systems have come in, a lot of events are using tracking systems. It's now catered for in the rules. So you can specify that tracking systems apply without having to write lots and lots of words to make it happen. In part 5, although a lot of organising, there's a couple of things that are worth noting. The sailing instructions now may specify another way of delivering it other than in writing to the race office. So, because a lot of events are using an app on the phone, for instance. So that is now enabled in the rules. You have to identify the protestee at the time you submit the protest. You used to be able to alter it before the hearing, which caused a nightmare for organising because the protestee had gone home. And then it changed, and so now the only thing you can do is if you got it wrong or you want to change the protestee, the original protest becomes invalid, and you've got to get a new one in within the time limit. Otherwise, that's invalid as well. So you've got to be much more careful when you put a protest in. Interestingly, where and when is not required, but the incident has to be described. We could take a straw poll. Do you think an incident includes when and where it happens, or just what happens? I don't think it describes the incident unless you say where and when it happened. If you go out there for 3 races and you say this, but you haven't told anybody when and where, does that describe the incident? We'll see. If you're sit on protest, anybody sit on protest committees? So now when you apply the principle of the balance of probabilities to decide the outcome, you apply it to each fact in turn, and then you've established the facts, then you use those facts to determine the outcome, which is actually, I think, what you do in practice anyway. So was there an overlap at 2 boat lengths is the big debate. Once you've sorted that out, which is a fact, you know how to apply the rules. So in practice, I think it figures with what people do. It's just more explicit. There's a bit about national authority. So the national authority, if they send back an appeal to be reheard, they can limit the scopes. You don't have to necessarily do the whole thing. They can say, we just want you to find out, was there an overlap at 2 boat lengths? That's all we need to know. Don't start from the beginning. This one's quite important sometimes. So now there's a rule that says the organising authority can exclude a boat that tries to enter, but only before the first race. Once the first race has happened in the series, currently, you can't reject them, you have to go to the protest committee. That has now changed to the first race after the entry has received. And that is because some smart Alec, who knew he was going to get his entry rejected, waited till the first race and then entered and said, you can't reject my entry. And there's a tiny one here, you'll probably never come across it. It's in the entry system. If you're a world championship or world event that has quotas, there's a rule about how restrictive you can be on allowing the entries for it to qualify as a world championship with an Olympic class, because you can't stop countries entering an Olympic qualifier. So there's a thing that if anybody tries to, they can go to the jury and get that opened up. And to fit with the concept that we often apply discretionary penalties to class rules, Rule 78 has changed. It's not just DSQ if you don't comply with the class rules. you can go and you can get a discretionary penalty, the same as if you were protested. So, tidy up really. And a national authority may now specify a minimum number of members for a protest committee. Otherwise it's one, and the RYA have not made any specifications. So the one-person protest committee is perfectly valid.
Is that true, John, for international juries?
If it's not, well, there'll be an international jury, and it has to be 5 people, or 3 if it's in different countries. So this is just for protest committees rather than, if you want no appeal, you have to comply with the international jury qualification.
Surely you could.
Sorry?
You can deny the right of appeal if it's required for the next stage of the event.
If there are some other reasons why you could deny the right of appeal. But in terms of the numbers and the constitution of the protest committee, it would only be an international jury. Well, the national authority might say, well, we'll approve no appeal, but you've got to have at least 3 people.
But it's not required to deny for the next stage of the event. So if I'm running a team racing event this weekend and I don't like somebody, I can protest and have a jury who want to disqualify them, and there's no appeal. I'll keep you.
Correct.
Yeah. Sweet.
If you want brownie points,
Yeah.
that's correct. That's the changes. There's 4 more slides with all the changes that have no effect as far as I can see. Do you want to go through all those? No, we've seen enough of this sort of stuff. Thank you very much. I agree. Is that all right? Well, again, just... and it's my classification, by the way, about what I think is important. You may well have different views. And actually, there's nothing significant, thankfully, from last time in the whole concept of apply. This is where we get into, okay, so we're going boat racing now. How do we apply the rules? This is where we're getting into what's the techniques that we use for applying the rules at boat speed, at racing speed. Is that all right? Move on. So we're talking about the rules of part 2, which is when boats meet, port and starboard and all that sort of stuff.
Sheets, yeah.
Yeah, you've got sheets. So you're going to see 2 slides, and you've got a sheet, because I'm going to go through and create the slide that you've got on your sheet, but then I'm going to move on, and you might need to look at it so that you can go back, because I can't do that on the screen. But you can take this away and keep it. So when you read the rule book, it's pretty complicated in part 2, because it's got unless this applies and that applies, and I hear discussions in the bar about I was entitled to room, yeah, but you were on starboard, yeah, but I was there and you were there, and the conversation is very confused. Has anybody had those conversations? But we'll see how clear you are about the rules as we go through here. Another way of looking at the structure of the way the rules are put together in part 2 are not necessarily in the sequence that they appear in the rule book. But you will find there is a whole bunch of rules, actually there's 8 of them only, that have the term keep clear in them. And there are only 8 of them. Call out a couple of them.
Port starboard.
Windward leeward. Port starboard. So you know the rules. Great. I'm going to crack on. There are some rules then that talk about giving room or mark room. They don't talk about keeping clear. They talk about mark room. Then there's some rules that talk about proper course. How many of those are there? 2. Then there's some rules that talk about you can't interfere, you can't avoid, and I call them the if possible rules, because every single one of those rules has got the words impossible. It does not, there's no rule that says you shall not have contact with another boat. It's not in the book. It says if possible, avoid contact with another boat. Which means you don't necessarily break the rule just because there's contact. It might not have been possible. And that's always an interpretation, because if you go far enough, if I never go boat racing, I'm never going to break that rule because it's not possible. So I can always come far enough back in time, and you can always argue it was always possible to avoid contact, but we don't apply the rule that way. Right. So how many rules are there? Under keep clear. We've called 4, 8, and here they are. Port starboard, windward leeward, ahead of stern, tacking. There's one about continuous obstructions. There's also, if you're returning to start from OCS, if you're taking a penalty, you have to keep clear, even if you're on starboard and the other one's on port, you have to keep clear. And there's if you're sailing backwards as a result of backing your sail. No, this does not have all the words of the rule. It just says there's a rule about sailing backwards. There are no other rules in the book that talk about keeping clear. So can you remember those 8? Not so hard. A lot easier than remembering the whole rule book.
Who's backwards? Just sailing backwards or being drifted backwards?
It is sailing backwards as a result of backing the sail. So if you happen to go head to wind and the wind pushes at you, it does not apply. Then there's some rules that talk about giving room. The obvious one is mark rounding and obstructions, but there's also if you acquire the right of way, you have to give somebody room. We're going to look at a bit more of these. And there's if you're the right of way boat changing course, you have to give boats that are affected by your change of course room to be able to keep clear. Right? Remember those, sort of? Good. There's 2 proper course rules. If anybody can guess why that's in blue, it's quite deliberate. Good luck to you. I'll buy that person a drink. I'll be really careful how I say that. But there's the inside boat jibing at a mark. Sorry? Somebody guessing? Somebody guessing? No, too late. Avoiding contact is, so I say if possible you shall avoid contact with the boat. If somebody capsizes in front of you, it says if possible avoid that boat. Because it might not be possible. If she capsizes right in front of you, you might not be able to stop. If you're a boat racing when you're not, and I race at Livingston River, we go off the slipway, we have to turn left off the slipway, and that crosses the starting line of boats coming down the river. You can't get to your own start unless you set off before everybody else. You can't always avoid interfering with somebody. You've got to try. If possible, you shall avoid interfering. It's not always possible. And then if boats are taking penalties, well again, if somebody suddenly takes a penalty in front of you, you might not be able to avoid interfering with them. Might not be possible. So there's one other rule that does not fit into these columns, and that is 18.3, tacking up the zone, and again it's in blue. Anybody having a guess yet what blue is? It doesn't apply to windsurfers and kiteboards. And capsized boat is about hindering because they don't have the concept of capsizing in the same way that most of us are used to. So don't worry about the blue, I would guess, from your reaction. Right, so look, what we're going to do is we're going to just look at these 2 tonight in 10 minutes. And just get some thoughts about how these rules work together and how we apply the rules at speed. I promise you that not everybody will get this the first time you see it. And I'm not making any excuses for that. In my experience, it is worth persevering to get it sorted. So we've got these 2 sets of rules. So the first thing that we need to do is to look at keep clear rules. There they are again. So what is keeping clear? Anybody?
Boat keeps clear when a right way boat can sail her course without undertaking avoiding action, and if they are overlapped on the same tack, the right way boat can change course in either direction. Immediate contact.
Fantastic. Did you get that? Notice, keeping clear is not avoiding contact. It is when the right-of-way boat, the fundamental one we're going to look at, when the right-of-way boat can sail her course without the need to take avoiding action, you are keeping clear. Conversely, if she has to take avoiding action, you are not keeping clear. Right? Let's have a look. And that, so when you see it in a blue background, it means I've quoted it directly from the rules. And the interesting thing about keeping clear is a right-of-way boat is right-of-way when the other boat is required to keep clear. So keep clear does two things. It says which boat has to keep clear, and it also says which boat has right-of-way. Because there are some rules that apply to right-of-way boats. Have we got that?
Course is not defined.
Sorry?
Course is not defined.
Course?
Her course is not defined. So how, if the right-of-way boat starts changing course, how?
Of course, it's the direction she's sailing.
Okay, so it's instantaneous.
Yep. But as always with the rules, I'm an engineer and you get used to dealing with micro stuff sometimes. If you do differential calculus, you get into, we're not talking about micro, I mean, you cannot sail a boat in a straight line. It's not possible. Does that mean you're subject to, you're always changing your course? No, not in practice. It's got to be at least noticeable by other boats. Otherwise, you've got to apply the words in the context in which you find them. So, we've done what is keeping clear, and I think you quoted that almost word for word. So, fantastic, saves me reading it all out. So let's have a look at this then. This is an absolutely bog standard, no tricks scenario, coming into a leeward mark, port rounding, blue and yellow. Hands up if you think yellow has to keep clear. Who thinks blue has to keep clear? Who hasn't got a clue? So we've got an even split between the people who thought blue. This is an absolutely standard situation in a boat race. So we start off, we really do need to sort this out. So let us sort it out. So there's the same situation. There's no tricks with this. There was an overlap coming into the zone. There's nothing there at all. Right. So which boat must keep clear? And you can only use the rules, if you look at your sheet, in the red column.
Windward boat.
So now we're all getting to windward boat. So blue is the windward boat. So what? She's the windward boat. Don't confuse keeping clear with giving room. That's the biggest mistake you will make and causes the most confusion. You can, to decide who has to keep clear, you can only use a rule that has in it, this boat must keep clear. Otherwise you don't have to keep clear. This might be revelation for some, so you will not get it first time. Don't worry about it, I'm going to keep going. So blue is the windward boat. It's the only rule. The good news about that red column is only one rule applies at any one time. You will never find a situation where two of those rules apply at the same time. But there's always one that applies between two boats. So you can always find one. In this case, it's windward-leeward. Blue is to windward of yellow, so she has to keep clear. Yeah, we can see a problem coming. Don't worry, we can see a problem coming. We've got to solve the problem. Right, so which boat, now you'll be happier, which boat has to give mark room? That was easier, wasn't it? Because she's the outside boat when they enter the zone. Right? So now we have blue has to keep clear, yellow has to give room. Now next question, does blue keep clear? We look at the definition. If yellow's the right-of-way boat at position 1, does she have to alter course to avoid blue? Yes. So blue does not keep clear. That's what the definition of keep clear says. Don't worry about it, we'll unfold it. But that's the way the rule works. So yellow has to bear away. So blue has now broken rule 11 at position 2. That's a problem, isn't it? That the rules have to solve. Ooh, exclamation marks. How does the rule solve the problem?
Exoneration.
We need to leap out of this section to another section in the rules, and somebody's just mentioned it, into the words exoneration. And I'm not going to go and take too long over this because we're getting close to 8 o'clock. But rather than look at the bottom bit, rather than set up a whole set of precedences which change which rule overrides another rule, which I could tell you will be an absolute nightmare in the rules. And it would be turning on and off all the time. And you'd never know which precedence to give to the rules. So the rule doesn't solve the problem by giving preference. It doesn't say room overrides keep clear. It doesn't say that. It does say when a boat is sailing within the room or marked room to which she is entitled, is that yellow? Or blue? Sorry, blue. Is she sailing within the room to which she's entitled? Does she break a rule of part section 8? Yes, she broke rule 11. But she's sailing within the room to which she's entitled. She is exonerated from that breach. Instantly. You don't have to go to the protest room for the jury to do it. The rule applies right now. So blue, as long as she's sailing within the room to which she's entitled, is exonerated for breaking windward leeward. That has a major impact on the mark rounding.
Just a question, because she's broken rule 11, but your thing doesn't list rule 11.
Yes, it does.
Section A of part.
Oh, section A, part 2. Sorry, yeah.
It has a major consequence. So when blue comes in, which one's the inside boat in the diagram?
Yeah.
Right. Blue, if she's sailing within the marked room to which she's entitled, is exonerated for breaking rule 11. What happens if she bears away here? She's no longer sailing within the marked room to which she's entitled, so she does not get exonerated. It's brilliant. So she can't push the whole fleet away from the mark. She's got to go around the mark reasonably tight. Get that? And you see how that starts to work? And if you apply that in all sorts of situations, you'll find it solves a huge number of problems which would otherwise be conflicts within the rules. So you'll see a good protest decision is blue broke rule 11 but is exonerated under, you write the whole thing out, but is exonerated by rule 43. So which boat must keep clear? 11, we got there. So now we get, is blue sailing within the room to which she's entitled? Yes. We all agree. You see how we're all agreeing now? We're not arguing about which boat has to keep clear. Yes. So is blue exonerated? Did yellow give room?
Yeah.
So does she break a rule? So does anybody get a penalty? No. That's how the rules actually work. And you can actually apply that at speed umpiring, can't you, Bruce? You come in all the time. We always know which boat has to keep clear, which boat has to give. Then suddenly, the right-of-way boat has to give room of some kind. Now the question is the other boat sailing within the room to which she's entitled, or does she go out of that boundary? And you can apply that at the speed at which, I can tell you, I've done it, you can apply it at the speed at which international moths foiling do it. Once you've got the process sorted in your brain, you can apply that at racing speed. And if you pick that up tonight for me has been worthwhile. You might need to read it through again, which is why I'll send you the slides and you can go through it and ask questions. So There's a flow diagram which is on the other side of your piece of paper. So how do the rules actually work? We first look at the situation. Did somebody break a keep clear rule? One of the rules in the left-hand column. Was the only ones we look at to start with. If the answer is yes, did the boat breaking the rule? Was she sailing within room to which she's entitled? If the answer is yes, you carry on. If the answer is no, has she taken a penalty? If she's taken a penalty, carry on. If she hasn't taken a penalty, now we might have to go to the room to sort it out. Or persuade her in the bar afterwards that she was wrong. And that pretty well gets me through. I can apply this. All I can promise you is I have not yet, in now 40 years, found a single scenario where following this process does not resolve the situation. Not one. And I believe that getting that under your belt is so much more valuable than looking at every single situation and trying to say, well, in that situation, this is the outcome. That's it. Apply the process. And you'll get to the right answer. Does anybody, I've got loads of examples that I can go into, but we're getting close to 8 o'clock. Does anybody, does that cause any questions? I'd much rather answer your questions than move on to me.
Okay. What is the proper course?
Oh, a proper course is defined in the new book. It's slightly modified. It is, now this is where I follow my own rule. If in doubt, especially with the new, and I'm going to be doing this all the time if I can find the glasses. Somebody read it out for me. Proper course is?
A course a boat would sail in order to complete the leg she believes.
No, that's changed. And it's now changed. It's in the new rule.
Yeah.
I know, it's been updated. So, roughly, I think I know it. It is the course a boat would choose to sail the course as quickly as possible. So, it doesn't have, I mean, who has ever sailed a perfect race in their life?
William.
So we don't, important thing about proper course, we don't look in hindsight what was the perfect course, and if you deviated from that, that was not your proper course. We don't apply that. It's what would you do at the moment, in your judgment. Now that judgment, you would argue, has to be reasonable. But I mean, I've judged of cows, and I've seen boats going out the start of the fast net, and what happens? Some go to the mainland shore and some go down the island shore. No. They're sailing 30, 40 degrees difference. Are they both sailing a proper course? Yeah. If that's what they believe is the fastest way to finish, the answer is yes. If it's extreme, they might have to convince the protest committee what their reasoning was. But they don't have to try that hard. So that's your proper course. Yep. Done that one? Yep. Anybody else? What's for dinner? That was the one question. No, that was.
Is your proper course to go and go back into the yacht haven to replace a batten if it's broken and you're sailing back?
In some races, it probably could be. If that's it's arguable. I mean, we can get into some. You can get into some pretty good scenarios about it. If you're not breaking a rule doing that, but how are you going to get that new batten without getting outside help? Or taking a kit on board that was not on your boat at the beginning. You might have a problem, because if you break a rule, that cannot be a proper course. I nearly got out of that. I think a bit faster. Well, that's why I love doing this. You know, you get questions. I mean, who learns most about the rules tonight? Thank you. I like the process of getting questions that oh crikey, I need to think my way through that. And all I promise you is if I've said something and I go, oh, that wasn't right, I will contact you and I'll put the record straight.
John, at what point have you completed a tack?
What's anybody going to say? Now, there's two different answers. There's two different answers.
That's what I'm asking.
So in the rule, you're subject to Rule 13, while tacking, which applies from passing head to wind until you are on a close haul course. Nothing to do with your sails. It's the direction of... Now, there's an argument about close haul. If your down speed is close hauled lower than it would be if you're up to speed, because you're... I mean, we can get into the really fine details. But it is when you... Now, when you look at attack, which is in the word penalty, you have to jibe and tack. If you go to a sailing school, they'll teach you to tack. That's what attack is in the normal nautical sense and the use of the words. So unless in the rule book it's in italics when you use a definition, it's the nautical normal sense. So a boat is tacking, in my view, from the moment the helm starts to put the... you can even argue when the crew come off the rail on a boat, you know, you go, and then the helm starts going down, you have started tacking, and it's finished when you're on and you're sailing along on the next one. But the rule only makes you the keep clear boat from the moment you're past head to wind until you are close hauled.
So in this case, the wind was shifting 30 degrees.
Yes.
Causing both boats
And thank you for that.
voluntarily tack.
Yes, and it's quite common that a wind shift will change the right of way of the boat. Because it will put you through head to wind. If you're coming into the start line and you're probably sailing within 10 degrees of the wind and you get a 15 degree wind shift, it could well tack you. You've changed tack and you've done nothing. It's the nature of the beast. But again, that's going to come in, if say it goes into the room, you're going to tell your story, the protest committee go, yeah, okay. So we have a concept which didn't get into the rule book except in match racing, and I'm not sure about team racing, the last point of certainty.
Yes.
Until you're certain something's changed, it hasn't. It's a very useful principle. So because you're always going to have these marginals, and then, oh, it's different.
So the fact that the jib had passed to the other side.
How do you know if a boat's gone past head to wind? There's about 4 different indicators and none of them are perfect. Boat being upright, head sail, but if you're turning fast, the head sail will go through way before you've passed head to wind. Especially if you stop turning, and if you stop turning, it'll go through. It's probably the least reliable. The boom crossing the centre line sometimes, often in attacking during match racing, the boom flopping across the centre line, that's a good clue. But I did America's Cups in '92 in San Diego. Guess what the wind shear was from the top of the mast to the boom? 30 degrees of shear. It wasn't a wind shift, it was permanent. So when is an AC boat head to wind? And the funny thing is, you can make, it's like getting to close hauled course. I mean, that's not that precise, is it? But I will tell you, and I've tried it with people, if you go out on the water and you get a group of people watching a boat, and you get them all to blow a whistle at the moment they think that boat's gone through head to wind, or got to close hauled, guess what happens? The whistles go within a fraction of a second of each other. So actually, although you can get into all sorts of stuff like this is a real problem, in practice it's nowhere near the problem that you can create in my experience.
If I'm taking a spin, so I need to do a jibe and attack,
Yes.
and I don't really want to be on that attack, so I do the jibe, I then glance, go through head to wind, and then back.
You have not tacked.
I've not tacked, so I've not completed.
You've not tacked because you've not come on the nautical sense. You've got to get at least to close hauled on the other on the other side. Yeah. Yeah.
Has Rule 18 materially changed with that a stern bit that's been added.
I don't. Well, I mean, some
team races in the room.
Yeah,
Mark 3.
I mean, it's if there's no current, so when do you? So, rule 18 turns on at the zone when the first boat gets into the zone, and it turns off when the boat entitled to mark room no longer needs it. That's the point at which it turns off. But that's what it was.
I think the question is different. I think the question is if, maybe I'm wrong, if the outside boat is clear ahead but not in the zone, is that not real?
No, just, I mean, I know that like 2 changes ago, you used to, before that you used to be able to slam the door. I'm just checking that hasn't snuck back in or anything like that at Mark 3.
So, one thing is now clear, whatever the current is, Rule 18 has not turned off until blue has left it astern. Now that was not clear before, because at about this point, yellow could start to luff, and blue would have to respond because she can still go up here. But Rule 18 still applies, so she's still entitled to mark room. What is mark room? It's the room to pass the mark on the required side without breaking the rule, without hitting it. So blue would have to go up, but Rule 18 still applies. Now you get to, we'll forget the current just for a moment. So at this point, now Rule 18 is turned off. And blue is simply the windward boat. If yellow luffs now, she's got to luff slowly enough that blue can respond, but she can actually luff enough to force blue to tack. Now if there's current coming, let's make it that this way, and it's quite significant. If yellow forced blue into tacking here, she may well still hit the mark, even though she had passed it astern. Well, blue has not been able to pass the mark on the required side without touching it. So she's not been given room, mark room. So I don't think it's made a huge amount of it, which is why I've got it in there.
So we've not changed Rule 18 that if a boat is clear ahead and then a boat that's clear astern enters the zone and the boat clear ahead is outside the zone, in the past the boat clear ahead would have mark room, or you might interpret the rule to think they had mark room.
Okay, there's about 5 different scenarios in there in one.
This is now being cleared up.
I think it's been cleared up. I think it's probably clearer, but I don't think there's any. I think it's clearer, but I think it's how it was being used before. Can I mean, I'll happily spend some time with you afterwards and go through why I think that, but it would take.
Oh, I wouldn't have realised it until they changed the wording, but now it's just.
Yeah.
So if you're overlapped with the mark, so I'm thinking like a bear away, you're on port tack and you're bearing away, mark 2 to the team race.
So what are we doing? We're coming in, your team
and you're in clear ahead in front, you've entered the zone in front, so you're entitled
port rounding?
Starboard, bearing away, and the front boat has kind of got around the mark, is slightly away. How much? Maybe it should be.
Can you show me what you mean? And if it's team, and I'm going to say I have not read the updated
and
team
if anyone
rules. So
thinks I'm being an idiot, and
I'm going to rely on
please do. But I was. If your proper course was to the next mark. And nowhere near this mark, but in this new interpretation, you're still, it's not astern of you. I know in the old rules, you currently don't have any more room-related rights to like slam the door. So now you're still, this boat is still entitled, so could you arguably close that door aggressively?
Well, how did, let's go through, how did you get there?
Entering the zone.
Yeah, come on,
clear
show me
ahead.
how you got there.
Entering the zone.
I'll tell you what's going to happen to you. It's going to get astern of you before you do. Go on. Can you keep the mark? Can you keep the mark? You've got to keep the mark. You've got to keep the mark in front of the line. You've just passed the mark.
And then if I were
you've passed the mark, it's gone.
Okay, so it's gone.
Okay. As soon as So
Like,
you've
blue is still keep clear.
right. So you've got a line,
Because they're window.
but you've got a line at 90 degrees to your transom.
And then so
You've got to keep that line. If you've got to keep the mark in front of that line the whole time, and as soon as it comes out, you're past the mark.
So I think the first part of the definition says it's room to sail to the mark if your proper course is to sail.
If your proper course is to sail close to it. Yes.
If you were to jibe in towards it, then your mark room exoneration turns off exactly as it used to.
Yeah, I think so.
it hasn't changed.
I don't think it has changed. I mean, I'm sure there will be things in team racing that are going to test this. It's going to test it a bit more.
John, I think we could go on for another 2 hours.
Yeah, we could.
John, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much for staying here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all coming.
I'm very good. Very good.